Welcome to the 2020 Walter Swan Poetry Competition. The competition received over 200 entries this year, and we were impressed by the level of the submissions and the way that the entries responded to the theme of a kindness. The main competition was judged by Professor John Whale, who we'll be hearing from later, and the 18 to 25-year-old category was judged by me, Dr. Rachel Bauer.
Hello, my name is Nicola Swan, and I'm the chair of the Walter Swan Trust, which has sponsored the poetry competition with the Ilkley Literature Festival in 2020. Thank you so much to everybody who's taken part and submitted a poem. I know the judges, as always, have had a real challenge in selecting the winners, but I've had such pleasure in reading the winners. So thank you so much for submitting your poems. Thank you so much for taking the time to send them in. Thank you to the judges. Thank you in particular to the Ilkley Literature Festival. And I'd just like to say this is, of course, in memory of my husband, who was a poet himself and who would have had such pleasure in reading the poems on the theme of kindness, which was so very special to him. It's particularly nice to note that all the winners are from Yorkshire. So thank you.
It was, as ever, a great privilege to be able to read poems submitted to a competition. As a judge, you are always humbled by the entries, and on this occasion, the general standard was really high. I looked at a wonderful set of very accomplished poems, and my selection of the three prize winners reflected a sense of the accomplishment and achievement in each of their poems. But I want to say something, first of all, about the topics that were evidently on the minds of the poets in the current cultural moment. Obviously, one might expect that the effects of the pandemic will be manifest in the poems, and that was certainly true, at least to the extent that hospital care featured quite prominently. But a very heartwarming aspect of the submissions was related to a more general awareness of the need for kindness and toleration at this time. In the prize-winning poems, I think we can find something of that call for kindness. There's no necessity for good poems to be good-hearted, of course, so this was a very welcome bonus. There was a particular poetic quality to the kindness in a number of the shortlisted poems, and I think that this might be said to be the hallmark of the Ilkley competition this year. I really enjoyed Finding Your Soap because it was, to my mind, a very accomplished poem in the way in which it managed a particular memory. I was particularly impressed by the way in which it ended. Quite often one will look at a poem and be going along with it until we get to the end. Endings can be disastrous. Endings can change poems for the worse. They can destroy everything that has been created. But here, I thought the poet managed the poem through the four stanzas really well, and it came to a very pleasing conclusion. It came through to that last line of technicoloured at our feet, and I thought the aptness of that verb technicoloured made the poem. I liked the idea of the poem, one that came out of the memory of childhood, a memory of the kindness offered by a mother. So I thought this was an adept poem at managing things very simply, and it managed to stay the disciplined side of sentiment. It could have strayed into the weakness of sentiment, but it held the thing up metaphorically and imagistically, so that our attention was held by the precision of how the soap was imaged to us throughout the poem.
Hi, I'm Chris Seward, and this is my poem Finding Your Soap, which was placed third in the Walter Swan competition. This poem has been through a long gestation. It was a short poem, a long poem, a piece of flash fiction, and now a poem again, and I'm glad it's found a home. The piece is based on a jar of constantly replenished used pieces of soap that seem to have been under my mum's kitchen sink all of my life. Finding Your Soap. In the cupboard is a chunky jar layered with old soap. I pour these misshapen jewels onto a sheet of newspaper and inhale a sluice of remembrance. Me, kneeling at the bath. You, pouring kettle-warm water onto my hair, singing supple lullabies, frothing a kindness of lather from the hoarded stubs. I recall those effervescent pinks and limes, subdued greens and ambers, zealously accumulated, that 55 years later are spread lustrous before me. I wonder if at the bottom of the jar there is a piece from 1970, the year you stopped your washing, and I drifted through adolescence towards exotic shampoo and a shaky self-reliance. As my hands explore the marble lozenges, you are once again in front of me, beckoning with a vast bath towel, fistfuls of treasured remnants, technicoloured at our feet.
I thought Foxes Up Churn Lane was a very achieved poem. It kept its discipline really well, and I thought it was really quite powerful on an imagistic level. It sets off in quite unspectacular fashion, but it is the way in which it holds to and feeds and aggregates the image that I enjoyed. And the first image that I came across in the poem that grabbed me was in that third line. As you speak, I picture it, a confusion of amber. Just that phrase, a confusion of amber in your headlights, is a very sharp, very apt image that triggers something in your response, that it is going to be important as the poem takes us through its development, its evolution of the idea. So the idea of a confusion of amber just struck me. That blur of the orange of a fox was something that immediately, imagistically, grabbed my imagination. And then you've got something to hold on to, and the poem knows that. It knows that you're hanging on to it and then feeding it through the rest of the poem. So that later on in the poem, when we get this idea of the fox being transferred from one speaker to another, it is in the speaker's mind. It is becoming the mulch of leaves. Again, that idea of smudged orange now being applied to leaves and a mulch is carried forward. It is suggestive rather than explicitly stated as a colour, but the colour orange is lurking in the background across the images. And then finally, that's completed. Again, as with the poem that came third, we have a very adept, careful, well-managed ending that doesn't put a foot wrong. So we end here with, set him down with sorry leaves flushed with his colour. That last line works both ways. It spills across. It flushes across both the consciousness of the speaker and the subject of the fox, so that the word works in both directions in terms of subject and object, in terms of person and fox. And also that idea of flushing, of colour, of the confusion of amber going back earlier in the poem. What the poem is managing to do is produce a heart of an imagistic, suggested coloration running through it that gives it an identity. It's managing that and not being too explicit and not putting a foot wrong makes the poem for me. Again, an unostentatious poem, a modest poem in some ways, particularly in the way in which it presents itself. But I think it works its way through as an exchange between one person and another and across one person and a fox or foxes. It does that subtly, without overstating things, and brings it to a well-managed conclusion. I really enjoyed it.
Hi, I'm Georgie Evans. I came second in the main competition, and this is my poem, Foxes Up Churn Lane. At least once a week you call, grin in your voice, and say you saw the fox up Churn Lane. As you speak, I picture it, a confusion of amber in your headlights, sunset bristles against the dark gesture of tarmac, the thing no bigger than the shock of its fur. It slips away, snatching a moment to erase itself from view, but returns in the night to cry behind the dustbins. The last time I saw one myself, he had curled into a singed knot on the lane, already becoming the mulch of leaves and mud that collects when the trees unhand themselves of foliage. I had never held a newborn, but his head lolled and I supported him in the crook of my elbow, set him down in sorry leaves flushed with his colour.
It Was a Kindness is a very powerful poem. There were lots of poems that I read in the competition that engaged with a similar kind of topic of death and memory, but I thought this was the one that took me to a different place. There was something of that very particular magic that poetry can do here. Poetry that can take us to a different kind of conversation, a different kind of linguistic act, demonstrating that poetry is that strange thing that can write round corners. And here, what it gave us was a strange place, a talking back from the dead. It is an impossible act. And that's what poetry can do. It can take us to a place which is outside realism, outside the usual function of social language. So here's a poem that dares, and I like that daring. I like that ambition, and I like the magic of the dead coming back to us. But it does that very strange, very moving, very spooky and odd thing, but in a way contained and simple through powerful language. It does it also with a clear demonstration, not only of the control that gives it power and clarity, but also a formal patterning as well. It is also a poem that uses the page really well and uses the space between lines and between these broken lines. And almost surreptitiously, it rhymes at the same time. So the way in which it is disposed on the page gives it a kind of solidity and quietness, and this space on the page allows us to move between things. This was the poem out of the whole bunch that made me go back into it, the one that intrigued me and made me not quite understand it. This was a poem that took us somewhere different in terms of language. It is a kind of impossible speech. I like to be taken back into a poem and inhabit it, and also be stretched by it so that I don't immediately understand it. Part of the magic is not wholly understanding a poem, so that you have to go back into it and inhabit it and live with it. I think this was a really powerful and emotional subject at a time that is highly charged with sadness and grief. It managed to allow us this space in which we can contemplate what it might be like to go back and visit one's family from the impossible space of death. That, I think, is magical and demonstrates what poems can do. I was delighted to find a poem that could do just that.
Hello, my name is Mike Farron. My poem is called It Was a Kindness, and I'm delighted that it won first place in this year's Walter Swan competition. It's dedicated to Sheila Farron. It was a kindness that the cat chose to purr on her lap, that when words failed her, poetry filled the gap, that when she looked in the mirror, she was surprised each time to find herself still so old, that when she looked deeper, there were rows upon rows of a family waiting to welcome her back to the fold, that their accents hadn't softened, that their words were just the same, that they picked up conversations dropped decades ago without stopping for breath, that everything was comfortably familiar, that like in life, there was nothing special about death, that she was able to stay until the cat had finished her song, that the cat did not sing too long.
So the quality of the poem submitted to the 18 to 25-year-old category was very impressive and showed that poetry in this category is flourishing and in a very healthy state indeed. It was very difficult to select only 3 winners. I'd also like to say at this point to everyone who entered, keep writing, keep going, keep submitting. Your work was great, the standard was very high. The poems I selected, the 3 winners, were poems that stayed with me, poems that got richer with every reading, and which speak something true about a kindness to our current times. In third place, congratulations to Georgie Evans, whose poem Grandma Evans is a lovely, warm poem of precision, deceivingly simple in its tercets and language, but reverberating with evocative sensory depths. The poem tells a story of intergenerational encounter, blooming vegetables and salt and oil, bringing cooking and stories and love together in an original and moving way.
Hi, my name's Georgie Evans. I came third in the 18 to 25 category, and this is my poem, Grandma Evans. When I'm home, we finish the jigsaw disappearing under dust on your kitchen table. You send me downstairs to the garage, where I choose a can of pop to drink while we cook. Fetch me that knife, you say, and the chopping board. On it blooms a forest of vegetables, too colourful even to provoke the disgust of a child. You slice carrots, onions, peppers, with care I recognise from your hand in birthday cards. I drizzle oil and grind salt from my fingers. You take the tray to slide it into the oven. I want to tell you one of my stories, but standing by your side I forget how it goes. So instead, I run water to wash the dishes.
In second place is Freya Jackson with Going to My First Smear. So this is a really surprising poem about the messiness of life, the way that everyday life carries on even in the face of crisis, the tangled business of ordinary tasks, medical appointments, writing, heavy skies. Formally, the poem experiments with space and with echo, as well as with repetition and looping, and it paints a memorable, powerful day. Congratulations.
Hello, my name's Freya Jackson, and I'm really pleased to say that I won second prize in this age category. So here's my poem. It's called Going to My First Pap Smear on the Day After I Finished My Period. I am trying to write a poem about kindness, but it is hard when all the mirrors hold their teeth backwards. And I have spent the morning being rejected by various kind emails, and trying to be thankful, I make jam in a large bottom pan and send it in the post with handmade labels to the usual suspects, promising them I know they are very small and cold and the pandemic wounds them, but I am thinking of them today. And yes, I know it will be put in the cupboard for another time when it is easier to be thankful. I go to the doctors and listen to 2 unremarkable songs play on the radio to the empty waiting room and feel hot inside my mask while the nurse is neither kind nor unkind when she tells me my blood is too close to the surface for me to be tested and there were no more appointments available until September. But 2 weeks after my mother's heart attack, I no longer have the luxury of believing myself immune to death. So I wait in my mask, and I am neither kind nor unkind to the nurse, just small and cold. Outside the rain is no longer falling, but it is held too close by the heavy sky. I have spent the day having to be thankful for the many kind emails asking how my mum is recovering, remembering to be thankful. They are asking about recovery and not. The moment is now far enough away that today I can be sad that I didn't win the poetry prize, and I had to reschedule my pap smear, and I overcooked the jam.
So, congratulations. In first place is Freya Sophie Carter with More Than Crumbs. So this was an ambitious poem which gets richer on every reading. It's a reimagining of the parable of loaves and fishes, a testament to the hard work and kindness that takes place every day in communities as ordinary people strive for a better world. But it's also a reimagining, without sentiment, of a world in which there's room for everyone, in which no one will be hungry. Stylistically, the poem's lyrical and deft, and at the same time, it's sensory and very down to earth. So well done, Freya.
Hello, my name's Freya Carter, and firstly I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been involved with the Ilkley Literature Festival and the judging of the Walter Swan Poetry Competition. I was absolutely delighted when I heard my poem had won first prize in the 18 to 25s category. It's called More Than Crumbs. I'm not religious, but there's something in that story. The one where 5 well-risen loaves could fill 5,000 stomachs, and 2 fishers in their baskets could swell into several shoals. The contented crowd chattered, resting cracked souls, hands ceaselessly conveying bread to mouths. And after the banquet, with more than crumbs left over, they hauled 12 basketfuls of broken pieces back, though none would go to waste. And some say it was a miracle of another sort, man-made, the people breaking into their provisions to share them, split them, with strangers who had nothing, so everyone had enough. And there's something in this, when the charity lady bangs flat-palmed on the locked doors of the local metro at 10:30 p.m. to wake the workers, and several high-vis Lowy figures wheel out crates of baguettes, potatoes, carrots, and she piles them high into the van, slams the doors, flicks on the headlights, gently toasting the road with a golden glow. And when the fancy chefs drop in to turn some ragged chicken into a 5-star slow-cooked sensation, served with capers and smashed roots, and the soup kitchen's small startups heap vat after vat of bubbling brews, and folk mark the frosty pavements with their feet, pounding the back alleys to give out parcels. And in my dreams I have a room, a table ready laid, a warmed oven, an open door. Come in, drink, eat, pull up a seat. Of course there is room for one more.
I hope you enjoyed hearing from our winners, and thank you very much for joining us today.